Today I want to tell you about a man that you've never met. I've never met him either, but I'd like to. And someday I will. And I hope when I'm done today you want to meet him too, because he lived a fascinating life. There are a lot of ways to tell his story. You could tell it like a drama of opportunities and setbacks. Here's a guy, ordinary beginnings, lived in a country that was very religious in a bad way. But there was plumbing, there were clean streets, but for some reason he decides to leave there and live in a tent for the rest of his life. Kind of curious, although he probably would have preferred something a little nicer as time went on. He was not a poor man. He was the oldest of three brothers. How many of you are firstborns? Have quite a few. There are more firstborns than any other. Little mathematical thing I picked up on. Anyway, I'm not a firstborn, but if I were, there would be perks. But it can also be a tough burden to carry, don't you think? One of the brothers died and left a son that our guy felt obligated to care for. Now, actually, he didn't have any children of his own, so that worked out okay, mostly. His own wife is barren. Nothing unusual about that. Well, part of the family begins a road trip to another country. It's a long story. But they get hung up on the way. The grandpa dies, and they head out again. And now get this, I kind of neglected to tell you that our man is already 75 years old when he goes traveling. So picture him waltzing out of the old folks' home in a walker. Although his wife is 10 years younger, a regular spring chicken, which I've heard is younger than a summer chicken. I don't know why, but anyway. So I would guess they take their time moving on the road, pull into all the rest areas, if you know what I mean, and our old man and his young wife and his nephew eventually get to that place where they plan to be safe and sound, and they live happily ever after. Not. That's not how it went. But now the story starts getting interesting. They no sooner arrive in the land than a famine hits, and you know where there's no rain and everything dries up and there's no food. There's not even flour for flapjacks or dry bagels. So in order to survive, they think they need to move somewhere where there's food, and so they do. But there, our man gets involved in a situation where he has to pretend that his wife is his sister. That's a long, pathetic story. Our guy is just trying to save his neck at the expense of his gorgeous wife. Did I forget to say that she was beautiful? Now, I know that true beauty just gets going around 65. And my wife told me that she can't wait for that to happen 20 years from now. But anyway, this a little advice, don't ever do what he did. Nothing good is going to happen when people who are married act as if they're not, or when people who aren't married act as if they were. Well, by now the famine is over, so that they can go back to where they wanted to be, and now they live happily ever after. Not again. Now, I said that they're pretty rich, but that presents a problem. The nephew and the uncle each have too many cattle for the same place, so they go their separate ways, with the nephew getting all the best land. Well, I'm fast-forwarding a lot here, but the uncle at least has his beautiful young wife, and they live happily ever after. Still not true. Now, it's nice to be rid of the nephew, but they still have no son or daughter. Life goes on for them. They do the best they can, the man and the woman. Can I call them patriarch and Mrs. Patriarch? It's hard being a patriarch unless you're the father of someone. Well, 10 years have gone by without a child, so you do the math. That makes the wannabe daddy how old? 85. And Mrs. Patriarch, the wannabe mommy, is how old now? 75. How many of you know people who became first-time parents at that age? They hadn't either. So our lovely Mrs. Patriarch hatches a little plan to have her maid get pregnant. And I know this story is getting weirder by the minute. And by the way, don't let me lead you astray on this. The surrogate thing may not have been a sin in their time and place, but it was never a good idea. The kid is born, and there is nothing but trouble. More time goes by. Now our patriarch is 99, and for some reason, he doesn't stop trying to have a baby with his wife, which is a little bit laughable when you think about it for more than 2 seconds, but here this is not an ordinary story. I wouldn't be telling it. In fact, this old couple laughs about it too. In fact, there's a lot more I could tell, but I'm pleased to announce that they finally have a baby, a bouncing baby boy, and no one can have been happier or prouder than these two old folks who finally have a product of their love, a little baby buggy between the two wheelchairs. And now they really have a good laugh and invite everyone to laugh with them. When the boy is weaned, they throw a big party for everybody. And then they finally can live happily ever after. No. Because now something happens that can't possibly be a happy story because it's weirder than anything so far. In fact, it's a little scary. After the boy has grown some, the old man takes him up a mountain. He takes the boy and some firewood. He gathers some rocks and circles them around for a burning place, an altar. Puts the wood on it, ties the boy on top, takes a knife. He intends to kill his son and then burn him there as a sacrifice. Now, that would sure make it look like the patriarch hates his son, but that would not be true. Or you might think that the son must have done something dreadful that deserved the death penalty, but that would not be true either. He's a loyal and devoted son, loved by his father. This is the part of our story no one can explain. How does a dad who waits for a son till he's 100 years old take that very son and raise a knife to him? But the good news is that just in time, the man sees a ram nearby, and he lets the boy live and sacrifices the ram in his place. Man, I was afraid this was going to be a tragedy, but it's not. And now they lived happily ever after. Now, by the way, a lot of you know this story, but somebody told me that preachers make a mistake. They underestimate the intelligence of their audience, and they overestimate what they actually know already. And some of you may not know the story of Abraham. Well, here it is. The boy grows up until he's a man, and he's struck down with grief. When his old mother dies, the old man too, and the old man weeps. In the process, he bargains for a place to bury his wife, the only land he'll ever own. The patriarch has just one thing to do before he can die in peace. That is, he needs to find a girl for his only son to marry. And when they find her, then this is when deep comfort comes to both the grieving son and the grieving patriarch. And the old man then passes on all his possessions to his son. At the ripe old age of 175, he is buried beside his old wife, and the son carries on in the name of his father with all due respect. And the patriarch dies, you could say, happily ever after. Now that's the true story of Abraham from the book of Genesis. 14 chapters in about, 7 minutes. Now what's wrong with that story? It's the way I told it. I left God completely out of it. It's an interesting story even without God, but without God, most of it doesn't make much sense. There's simply no explanation for most of Abraham's life unless God is involved. And I wonder if that's not the definition of a life of faith. It is a life that defies explanation unless there is a God who is real and is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. How do you explain why Abraham abandoned for good his home country with its conveniences, with all its familiarities, and took off for a land that he didn't know anything about, only to live for 100 years in nothing but a tent using outhouses? How do you explain why he didn't go back to Ur once he found out what perpetual camping was like? Or why his wife Sarah didn't leave him when she also didn't want to live in a tent forever, but when she realized that he would rather risk her purity than risk his own neck? And why did he do something so foolish as letting his nephew Lot take first choice of the land? Now, why did he persevere in trying to have a son after he and Sarah were well shriveled? And how did they eventually have a baby when they were so cotton-picking old? And hey, why did the patriarch go up the mountain with his son to make a sacrifice of him? Man, the questions you have to ask when you read a life like this. You can't explain these things until you see God in the story. And in a bit, we're going to review the major points of the story from the text of Hebrews and have a chance to honor God as the first and foremost character in this old man's drama. But before we do that, I have to say that from Abraham's side, this is the story of a man who had to learn to trust God, often the hard way. This is a man who got enrolled in the school of faith for a lifetime, never even got a summer break, always learning faith, always having to learn faith. You learn here that faith is not a one-time deal where you walk an aisle, pray a prayer, and you're a Bible believer, and that's it. It's a lifetime of learning how to trust God. And in fact, when you think you've learned everything you possibly could about walking with God and it's time to flip the tassel, toss the cap, and have a gap year, you find out you're still in kindergarten. And so here's the deal. As we review the life of Abraham through the lens of Hebrews, you're going to learn a lot about faith. That's what this whole chapter is about. That's what his life was about. This was the signature of Abraham. He learns little by little to trust God, to lean on God, to say yes to God. And this is the secret of his life. This is his life message. Remember that Hebrews 11 is a stunning gallery of men and women who had faith and did not shrink back, as we have at the end of chapter 10, even when following God cost them, and who therefore received God's commendation. And so we've already seen Abel, we have seen Enoch, we have seen Noah. If you were here last week, you've gone through all of these. These people that highlight the fact that those who show faith in God will be commended and rewarded for it. But they each get just one verse. Abraham gets 12. He is the premier faith guy. The great Moses gets only 8 verses. So let's start moving through those verses from Hebrews 11. It's a selective retelling of the patriarch story where God gets center stage. In broad strokes, here's the life of faith in 4 parts. Each shows an aspect of the development of faith, from the exciting time when someone first meets the reality of a God who has a plan for him, didn't know such a thing could be, until he experiences a test he could never have imagined and has nothing to hang on to except God himself. You may have been there. Maybe you are right now. I think you can relate to these, beginning in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 to 10. Faith starts with the unsettling call. And so it says, by faith. Now, anytime we come to the word faith, I've highlighted it in yellow, so I want you to say it with me. So by faith, faith. Now, whenever faith is mentioned, God is being honored as God, because it's faith in someone. It's not, oh, I'm a person of faith, which means I'm sort of spiritual. No, in the Bible, faith means an actual trust in God. So when it says by faith, it means because he trusted in the living God. So by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called, obviously by God, to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, his faith had legs in a U-Haul, not knowing where he was going. So let's just say that the journey of faith begins with obedience. If you don't obey God, don't pretend that you trust him. God doesn't start you out with something impossible. It's just that he calls the shots from now on, not you. So that's faith's first lesson. Faith responds with obedience to whatever God has said without exception. Now, when you first start on this track, you don't really get that without exception part, but he was tested on it right away because God did not give him full information, not knowing where he was going. And he could have said, hey, my mortgage is paid off, I paid off my student loans, I've got life the way I want it, and God wants me to pick up, at least draw a circle on a map or give me directions on MapQuest or something. But no, by faith. He goes out not knowing where he's going. Verse 9, by faith. Everyone say it with me. By faith. Because he trusted in the living God, he went to live in the land of promise. You've heard about the promised land. Now, after they had gotten to Haran and Abraham's father died, God gave Abraham a command and then a 7-part promise. Now, we could stop and read all of those. This really is a turning point in the history of the world. God speaks and everything changes. But by the time God is done describing Abraham's future and other installments of telling him what this promise looks like, the patriarch will have a suitcase of promises, all about a land, all about a seed, all about a blessing. And this new land will not feel like home. So it says, as in a foreign land. Wow. Well, he's going to live there 100 years, but he personally won't own a square foot of it except for a burial cave. And so it says, living in tents with, or as did, Isaac and Jacob, his son and grandson, heirs with him of the same promise. Anytime you see the word promise, think the covenant of God, committing himself to what he is going to do in blessing these people. Now, this is a camping dynasty, by the way. They pass on their REI memberships in their will. They know how to start a campfire with a left-handed chopstick and survive on camel jerky and s'mores. But here it is, a tent. They had to live in tents all this time. It means that you have no roots but God himself. And if that's the case, then God's got to be all your stability. He is your reward. He is all you have. And this is where the without exception starts to be in play. Well, verse 10 sort of explains how he was able to do this for all that time. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations. And that would be a big upgrade over a tent with a dirt floor. And by the way, God has nothing against country living. He's going to make a city. It's just that at that time, living in a walled city was the only way to be safe. So a city was a symbol of security and lasting blessing. And living out on some logging road in Kapalsin would be the symbol of dead, at least at that time. Well, this is the story of how God took a man out of the city of man with all its security and all its human glory so that this man could search for a better city, the city of God. It is a theme throughout the Bible, all the way through the book of Revelation until we have the New Jerusalem. God goes on record that he plans to spectacularly bless Abraham and all his descendants, and in fact, in an expanding sort of way. A blessing on Abraham means a blessing on a nation, and in turn, a blessing on all the peoples on earth. And finally, the blessing comes to you and to me. And it's all God's doing because this city has a designer, it has a builder, and that builder and designer and builder, the architect and contractor is no one else but God. Not Abraham, not some human builder, but God. Now here's what faith teaches us. Because here's Abraham. I mean, he actually couldn't have built this city. I mean, he never had resources to do that. Wouldn't have known where to start. But when God wants to do something great, he consistently chooses someone who couldn't do it without him. They will have to give all the credit to God for whatever gets done. They will have to trust him. They will have to obey him. They will be able to say, well, I just followed directions. So it starts with a guy who simply packs his suitcase. What made Abraham make this move? What made him do this? To willingly leave the known for the unknown. Well, the preacher Stephen gives us the fuller answer to that at the start of his sermon in Acts 7, the sermon that got him killed. He said, the God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia before he lived in Haran. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he ever lived in Haran, before the promises were given to him. Before the patriarch ever left glorious Ur, God showed Abraham his glory. And that's how you start the journey of faith. You have to see something of God's glory and know that it is bigger and better than anything you have now. And that's why you're willing to surrender your comfortable past for an unknown future, but you'll never do that unless you have seen something of God's greatness and majesty. That is what we're supposed to learn in the gospel. Now, many of us can't bear leaving the city of man because we don't open our eyes to see the God of glory, who was designing a city for us that will last forever. Well, next comes the unlikely child. Because not only is there a land in the promises, there is a seed or a progeny or descendants. So if we call this the unlikely child, I mean, you're going to get this easily because these people were old. Come to verse 11. We have God's supernatural gift of Isaac to this barren old couple. You can't produce a great nation if you never have a child. So by faith, so everyone do this with me again, by faith, that is because she, now it's talking about Sarah, also implies Abraham, trusted in the living God. Now it says Sarah herself received power to conceive. The way that language works, you've got to add Abraham to that. There's got to have a little help from Abraham. This was not a virgin birth. So anyway, when she was past the age, or a birth where it's only a woman involved, since she considered, and this is the important part of this, since she considered him, who is him? God, faithful, who had promised. This is a double miracle, because here was a woman who was barren. It wasn't like a woman who had children before, and now she's crossed through menopause and she can't have children anymore. This woman never had children. And so here, in this double miracle, now I'm not going to tell you the embarrassing story of how Sarah laughed in unbelief the first time she heard she was going to conceive, but eventually she came around. And so therefore, this is the result, verse 12, from one man, and him as good as dead, so it wasn't just her, it was him too, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore, too many to count. This was just as God promised him. Although we found out later that he would die before I saw more than maybe a few dozen grains of descendants in his line. 10 years have gone by in the land without a child, and now you remember Sarah's little plan to have her maid Hagar get pregnant. They couldn't see how God could possibly fulfill his promises through them, so that they took the fulfillment into their own hands. They believed in God, but they didn't know if maybe he could use a little creative help. But that meant trouble. And so in the school of faith, they would have to learn that faith refuses to limit God by what limits me. Faith depends on what God is like, not what I am like. With me, I can't even get one son. With God, it's the stars and the sand, infinity and beyond. Now be careful, don't take this passage as if it taught categorically that anything but waiting on God to do things supernaturally should be condemned. As if it's wrong, for instance, to pray for healing sincerely, but then also go to the doctor and get some help. Or if it's wrong to pray, give us this day our daily bread. That's the Lord's Prayer, right? And then also go to work and bring home the bacon, or be the breadwinner. God is not against natural means, but he is against anything that seeks proudly to produce what God has promised by some avenue that does not depend on God. And so what is at stake in this situation with Abraham and Sarah is whether or not they believe God humbly, dependently. I think about Psalm 127. I was just randomly reading that psalm on Friday. And it starts with that. This is from Solomon. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. So you're trying to build a house, but how does God build it? You build it, but you do it with the strength, the humility that gives God credit. And it also talks about the bread, eating the bread of anxious toil. That's laboring without faith. And so the old couple in faith continue to try for a baby in the normal way, and finally the kid is born. Does that amaze you that in spite of their immaturities and insecurities, God still worked his plan for them? He did. God determined to bless them in order to bless others through them. And so the same for you. As you grow in faith, you learn. God is not limited by your limits. Well, Hebrews 11 goes on, to describe something that is so hard to be content with, and that is that most of God's blessings to us are not in this life. Now, if you're one of those first readers of Hebrews, what you're seeing present tense is that enduring in the faith is hard. It means suffering. What's the benefit of being a Christian? Maybe we should just go back. That's the theme of Hebrews. But hey, what the school of faith teaches you is that you may not get all the blessings now, but you get all the promises. And you get the God of glory who made them. You don't want to be like the reckless nephew Lot who had to have the whole enchilada right then. Here's where Hebrews talks about the unearthly city. And so at this point, we're going to be talking about not just Abraham and Sarah, but probably including Isaac and Jacob. These all died in, everyone say it, faith, by trusting in the living God. Not having received the things promised, remember the land, the seed, and the blessing, but having seen them and greeted them from afar. They're sort of out there somewhere, future tense, and having acknowledged, so there's something they said to one another, that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. We got our home there. And so it says, for people who speak like that, they admit that this world is not their ultimate home. They make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. Now, he wants to make sure you don't misunderstand that. It's not just that they were homesick for some grand human city like they had left in but, with the fine restaurants and the winning football team. And so he says in verse 15, if they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But it wasn't that. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. This is the city whose architect and builder is God himself. Therefore, now this is the most astounding statement. God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. We can all think of dozens of ways that we must have made God ashamed of us. You can read many instances where God would have been ashamed of Abraham for how he acted. Where he would have said, you know, I don't know this guy. Take the ichthus sticker off that car. But it says, because of their faith, they're looking forward and desiring what he had for them, that he was not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. That is, he shows and proves how delighted he is in their faith. He's actually going to make a city for all his friends. So we're in the school of faith, and we have to learn that faith focuses not on the present reward, how much or how little, but on God and his approval. God is thrilled to have people with faith like this, and he is not ashamed to be called their God. But that means also that faith will need to be patient with the Almighty Promiser. Faith involves waiting, but waiting is hard. I had a true life lesson in the wait thing as I taught in Liberia one year. One year I was the whole team, 2006. During the second week there, I lived in a village called Smell No Taste. Actual name. It's the last little town you pass through right before the big turn into Roberts Field, the international airport, where we always board our plane to start the long flight home. And I taught literally at the end of a runway used by American GIs returning from Europe in World War II. It was the last stop before they would return to their loved ones from the bloodshed of war. And they were told, and this is how the town got its name, that when you left the airfield there, while they were between flights, if you leave the airfield, there will be this little town. And the food will smell great, but do not taste it. We don't want sick servicemen on these flights. And so if you just eat any old thing, you're going to get sick. And so they named the town Smell No Taste. Anyway, there it was. Well, in my mind, passing Smell No Taste normally meant I was just a few short yards from going home to my family. And this village was the last glimpse of real Liberia before going home. And I don't take this wrong, but it was a joy to know that I was leaving it behind. But on this trip, I had to live in sight of that tantalizing runway. And from where I taught day by day for a week, I could look out the back doors of the little chapel and see the tails of the planes flying people home. But I had to wait. And it was hard because I missed my family, I missed my home, and I missed you guys. And I was so close. And normally I would just leave, but here I had to stay. And on 2 evenings, the very SN Brussels plane that I would be flying out on at the end of the week swooped down and took other people and left me. And I stood out on the road where I could get a glimpse of the runway at night, and I watched those planes leave. But I had not finished my work yet. And what a metaphor for what it's like, waiting for heaven. And then I thought of the people in that village who lived year after year inside of those daily planes, people that never got to leave. And one evening, Ed Coffey took me at dusk to visit a little bombed-out home of a woman named Salome. She was starting a church in her little house there in Smell No Taste with half a roof. The little congregation got rebaptized every time the clouds burst during the service. And believe me, I'm not talking about sprinkling. Anyway, Brother Ed had to tell me her story, had her tell me her story, actually, how she had been abandoned by 2 husbands in succession, both of them pastors. During the war, they had left her, one for America and one for Nigeria later, with the idea that they would eventually send for her, but they never did. So they just left her there by the airport in that little town that she grew up in, waiting and waiting. And the 2 men forgot her and married other women. And so Salome, her name means peace, had to learn the difficult discipline of waiting. She said it like this with a smile: "The Lord never abandoned me." That's faith talking. That lesson was learned the hard way. And that is the third lesson of faith, the wait factor. Henri Nouwen said, waiting is a period of learning. The longer we wait, the more we hear about him for whom we are waiting. Faith focuses not on present reward, but on God and his approval. Faith certainly enjoys every installment of God's reward, but is content to wait for the full blessings until later it greets them from afar. So every day you just do the thing that would most honor God, and know that when you long for and desire that better country, and you refuse to pretend that this has to be home here, then that contentment makes God proud to be called your God. And to show his approval, he makes this fabulous, unearthly city, maybe fabulously unearthly, I don't know, for people like you, full of faith. It's a city without trash and crime or graffiti, no rotting buildings, no injustice and discrimination, no hunger, no homeless beggars, no domestic violence or pollution or politics or taxes. It's a place where nothing wears out, where paint does not peel, where relationships work. It's where God himself will live, and it will be perfect in every way. And he is making it for those who desire him. Without faith, it's not possible to please God, but with faith, God is so pleased with you that he wants to call you his friend and build a city for you. You might have left everything for God, but he will bless you far beyond anything you leave behind. I love that phrase from Psalm 16, "You are my Lord, I have no good apart from you." Last, we come to the unexpected crisis. I call this crisis unexpected because there was no way that Abraham could have seen this one coming. He'd been promised a son, and God will ask him to kill that son. Now, maybe you have been thrown some curveballs in your life, and you wonder how you could possibly have prepared for them. Maybe a handicapped child is born, or lost, or an untimely death. I can think of many examples of things that just knock you completely backwards. This is all that plus. And now we said that God works out his plan for you in spite of your limitations. But does that mean that God sort of bowls his way forward in his sovereign plan, and it doesn't matter what you think or what you believe or what you do? Not at all. He is constantly developing your faith. In fact, let's just say this. His main plan is you. That's what he's building. And he can use different things. He can use waiting. He can use a decisive test. And so we get that in Genesis 22. It starts with these words, "After all this," that is, after all these semesters of learning in the school of faith, then God tested Abraham. You get a test at the end. Or was it the end? Well, this is the final thing the writer of Hebrews has for us about Abraham, how God tests his faith with the sacrifice of his son. The test was not only unexpected, it was unthinkable. And so verse 17 says this, so say it with me again one more time. By faith, by trusting the living God, Abraham, when he was tested, that was the hard part, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises, that was the easy part up till then, was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, "Through Isaac will your offspring be named." Now God tells Abraham to sacrifice his son, his only son, the son he loves, the son in whom all the promises lie. If there's going to be a great nation for Abraham, it's supposed to come through Isaac, but now he's asked to kill the son. With Isaac dead, the covenant is dead too. The promises are nullified. This is unthinkable, because what it would mean is that God lied. Well, just as Abraham was asked to leave his past, now Abraham is asked to abandon his future. And he's asked to do that out of simple trust in God. That's a dilemma. Now, the only way Abraham could resolve this dilemma was by applying a faith lesson that he had learned earlier when Isaac was born. Don't limit God by what seems like a limit to you. And so he came up with verse 19. Now, he didn't write verse 19, but he decided there must be some way, and this is all he could think of. If God can birth a kid out of two good as old people, good as dead people, good as old too, he can raise the kid when he's dead. And so verse 19, he considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead. If that's where my seed will come from and all the promises, then God can do this. From which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. And you know the story, how God saved Isaac at the last second by providing a ram. It was evidently resurrection Abraham had in mind when he told the waiting servants, "We will come back to you." Now, I'm not going to insult the Bible by simplifying a chapter nobody fully understands. But I will say that when Abraham was done with chapter 22, that he knew, and in fact Isaac knew, a level of faith they never had before. And I can just about guarantee that God will send you, if he hasn't already, through experiences that will stretch you in ways that you never imagined, because he wants you to develop the depth of faith that comes only through testing. Maybe some test is going through your mind. Abraham had faced earlier tests and sometimes failed them. But Abraham had never faced anything like this sacrifice your son thing. And we all tend to accept some tests but not others. But here's the fourth lesson of faith from Abraham's life. Faith places no limits on what God may demand of me. Now, Abraham could have said, I won't accept a test that doesn't make sense. That would be my limit. But Abraham doesn't argue. Even though there were pretty strong points that he could have made, such as, I didn't sign on for anything this horrible. Isn't child sacrifice sort of out of bounds? And he doesn't try to negotiate or bargain. Take me, the old geezer, let the innocent boy live. At least then he could carry on the line. But no objections, just obedience. And somehow he had learned in the school that never takes a break that it's okay for God's purposes to be hidden. But you can be content with that and go with that only if you're sure of two things. That God is holy, faithful, and good, even if it doesn't look like it at first. And two, that you should judge nothing. Judge nothing until you see the final outcome. Being a Christian means you're willing to let God make life miserable for you at times so he can bless you in bigger ways. And some people say, well, if this is how God treats his friends, you don't want to even think about how he treats his enemies. Well, the fact is that we do not pick up very clearly what God is doing. We see one thing, something painful, maybe something that looks entirely purposeless, but something deeper is actually happening, something that fits exactly and produces something wonderful. But it is a fact that sometimes God blesses you in ways that look like he's killing you. Thomas Boston was an 18th century Scottish pastor. If you read his memoirs, you pick up a lot of things on how to be a godly person. Well, Boston's wife was not a woman of robust health. Every childbirth was for her not just an ordeal, but a threat to her life. Now, this is 1707. There's one person in this room, I think, that remembers that date very well. But anyway, Boston records having prayed earnestly for his wife's safety as she was close to delivering a child, but as it happened, it was the child who died, a son whom he named Ebenezer. Ebenezer, after that memorial to God's goodness, God's help that Samuel had set up in Israel. And Boston wrote this in his memoirs: I never had more confidence with God in any such case than in that child's being the Lord's. But his death was exceedingly afflicting to me, and a matter of sharp exercise. To bury his name was indeed harder than to bury his body, but I saw a necessity of allowing a latitude to God's sovereignty. A year later, Mrs. Boston delivered another son, whom Boston again named Ebenezer, but who also died as an infant. And after the funeral of this second Ebenezer, Boston wrote, I see most plainly that I must stoop and be content to follow the Lord in an untrodden path. An untrodden path. It's a path where I've never had to walk before. An untrodden path. Have you been there? Now, you can tell me if you can, who is a God like our God, who can require of his children that they pass through such deep waters, through such pitch darkness, such punishing sorrows, when every word of the covenant God made with them would lead them to believe that he would keep them from such trials and griefs? What kind of a God is he when at the end the children love him even more and trust him and are sure that he would never have asked such things if they were not absolutely right, good, and necessary? This taking God at his word, even when it seems that that word is null and void. And what is that but the highest compliment that a human being ever pays to a living God? Perhaps it is the most persuasive evidence possible that God has proved himself faithful to his people. He will not do me wrong. And if Abraham's sacrifice is too much for many skeptics who scoff at God, scoff at a God who would ask such a thing, it was too much. Well, it was not too much for Abraham himself, the one who actually had to endure this raw test on the untrodden path. Because of this test, Abraham, and to a lesser degree Isaac, submitting to his obedient father, are our greatest examples of extreme faith. And often, many times when we go through things, we say, well, it's not as bad as Abraham had it. This test is difficult, but God can help you even through worse. And because of this test, Abraham is this great example. And nothing but faith, well, this is nothing but faith in its purest, most Christian form. This extreme faith of Abraham and people like Thomas Boston and everyone called to follow the Lord on this untrodden path. Now, very briefly, I want to pass on a soul-searching takeaway. Just as Nate asked us to do last week, I want us to ask ourselves more faith questions to discover if we really trust God or not. So many times in my life when I'm going through some testing, some trial, I've had to ask myself, well, Bruce, do you trust him or don't you? I mean, you're a Christian. Come on now. Do you trust him or don't you? Now, I want you to imagine that they're making a New Testament era hall of faith. They're going to add it to Hebrews as a Hebrews 14. And you've received a letter that informs you that they want to include you in the new gallery of faith, and they've got a checklist, sort of an application. And they're not asking for perfection. Abraham wouldn't be in chapter 11 if that were the case, but they want your responses to the following questions. And I've given you 4 questions. They'd like to know what you learned so far in the school of faith. And as you answer each question, and you can work on this with a good friend or your spouse, include both your triumphs and your trip-ups. What they're looking for is faith, even the faith that you gain from your stumbles. And the biggest thing that they want to see is whether the life you have lived cannot be explained unless there's been a real God at work in and for you. And of course, the goal of that project would not be to exalt you, it is to exalt him. That's what Hebrews 11 is all about. You don't turn back, you don't shrink back in unbelief. You reach out to God because God is faithful, and this is what he has done. So what if they wanted to write your life story so that they could prove to other people that it's safe, right, good, and lastingly perfect, just to trust God with your life no matter what? And my hope as one of your pastors is that every person in this congregation would be included in such a chapter with both ordinary and extraordinary stories of your faith and God's faithfulness. And I believe that the many wonderful things that happen around here already prove that so many of you are people of growing faith that have found ourselves together on the untrodden path. So here's the first faith question. I'm going to do these fairly briefly. Is there anything God has revealed clearly where you have said no or not now? And that would contrast the times when you've just obeyed. And so God gives his word, and then everything we learn of God's will and ways is a test of our faith. It's the test of truth. God speaks, I obey, without exception. Do you obey or do you delay? Do you love to learn God's word so that you can learn how to please God more? Where are you saying no to God? And so we would like to read let's say it's your biography, let's say your name is Bob. Say, by faith, Bob obeyed God. He was involved in pornography, but he studied the Word of God. He realized purity was called for. He set that aside so that he could pursue God with purity. That will be a story of faith. Here's number 2. Where have you allowed personal limits or limitations to narrow your agenda? Now, a limit is what you won't do. Like, I don't do spiders. Or limitations, that's what I can't do or you can't do, like a handicap or a lack of gifting for something. Well, faith is measured by how much you depend not on yourself, but on the strength of God. It's what God can do through weak people who know that their limits don't limit God. So let's say you're terrified of flying, but you sign up for Liberia anyway. But maybe you say no to opportunities that would push you past your comfort level. So you don't get up here and give a testimony. I can't do that. Or reach out to a grieving person. I wouldn't know what to say. And then you spend your life as a risk avoider. You never try anything that actually requires the help of a living God when something could have been done through you where someone watching has to say, there just has to be a God. Look at that person's life. And so they're writing your story by faith. Say it's John Stabbert. By faith, John Stabbert served everyone he could in a helpful spirit. Question 3 is the whole waiting thing. In what ways has the long wait for the better country affected the way you deal with disappointments? Your life isn't going the way you want. But you forget that this isn't home yet. And so instead of contentment, you live by worry, or you complain, or you do dishonest things, or you cheat, or you get depressed. Faith is measured by how much you are satisfied with the Lord himself, even when life is hard. This is when you have to greet the things promised from afar. So maybe your story goes like this. By faith, Jane quit complaining about her yard and started to be grateful for the many ways her husband loved her. And the last question is when life feels severely upside down. Is there any crisis you are facing where you have pulled back from God because obedience feels like it would kill a cherished dream? This is the test of submission to the crushing demand. What has God demanded of you that requires extreme faith in the face of some kind of paradox where it looks like God has in mind the dashing of your hopes, the sacrifice of your comfort, the silencing of your dreams? How have you responded when obedience feels like the end of a dream, an untrodden path, where it feels like the fiercely sovereign God is asking too much of you? Has he asked you to bear an illness? Has he asked you to take up a thankless ministry, or to wait for God's provision, or endure a tough relationship, or end a sinful one, or to fight a weakness that he will not remove, to set aside your gifts for a time, perhaps a long time? Are you willing to saddle a donkey and load the wood and know with all certainty that you are called to embrace his will and follow him into the darkness? God is in the business of proving how right it is to trust him when it is hardest. And this is crucial, that it's mostly about God's faithfulness, not about your faith. This is how you get a life that defies explanation unless there's a God who is real and is a rewarder of those who diligently seek, not the reward, but who diligently seek him. The untrodden path is where the God of glory walks with you and you are watching him wide-eyed. So one last thing. Is it possible that God stretched Abraham and Isaac with such an extreme test so that he could shine a spotlight on the same mountain of sacrifice from across the centuries? For as near as we can tell, Jesus was crucified on that same location. Maybe not the exact same place, but here Jesus died, not spared by his Father. I'm forced to wonder, perhaps many others of God's people who are called to suffer at very deep levels do it also, so that the cross may be seen more clearly, the fellowship of his sufferings. I'm fascinated by Martin Luther's retelling of this story to his children. He started out, Abraham was told by God that he must sacrifice the son of his old age. Abraham turned pale. Not only would he lose his son, but God appeared to be a liar. He had said, in Isaac shall be your seed, but now he said, kill Isaac. Who would not hate a God so cruel and contradictory? Abraham bound Isaac, laid him upon the wood. The father raised the knife. The boy bared his throat. If God had slept an instant, the lad would have been dead. I could not have watched, says Martin Luther. I am not able in my thoughts to follow. The lad was as a sheep for the slaughter. And when Luther finished the story, Katie said, I do not believe it. God would not have treated his son that way. But Katie, answered Luther, he did. Let faith lead you to the cross. Last assignment, the same as we have throughout this little series on Hebrews 11. Read it again. And keep looking for those clues of faith, because this is what God desires from us. Let's pray. Our Father in glory, it is our calling to trust you, obey you, not limit you in any way. Be excited about what the future holds and be content with whatever you give because you give us yourself. And teach us, those of us who are in this room that feel like we're on the untrodden path. We've never been on it before. We don't know what it looks like. It seems like no one around us has ever even had to walk something as difficult as what we're going through. Help us to remember Abraham and Isaac. Remember how faithful you were. And then how faithful you are. Oh, we all need faith so much. Without faith, it's not possible to please you. If we do anything without faith, it's sin. Faith is the fountain of all the virtues that we long for, to be like Christ. We first of all have to trust you. So we come to you and ask that as you write the stories of our lives, they will indeed be testimonies of faith. And at the end, the amazing reward for the faithful. Thank you for all of this in Christ's name. Amen.